Okay, professor of human ecology at Lund University, and originally a PhD in cultural anthropology. Now we know. I wonder where he is. He's not here, but he will probably come back. But his research, he's very well known in Sweden and internationally as well, because he has done a lot of research, pretty radical research or radical perspectives on transformation, using concepts like unequal ecological exchange, talking about imperialism, neocolonialism, world systems theory, and so on. And also engaged in the public debate in Sweden. I think the Swedish will agree that he's visible as a profile, discussing degrowth, issues of civilization crisis, and so on. Is it back? Yeah. So we hope he
get thumbs up that you're hearing me. Great. Okay. I'm very sorry to be so late. I'll have to be a bit more efficient from now on. The technology has started revolting against me. Okay. What I want to say is that we have become very used to the notion of energy technology. And when I say we're used to it, I mean that we're not ready to question the concept. We take it for granted, very much like any object of nature, like a rock or a tree, anything that's around us. And energy technology is simply some kind of machine that through which we can derive energy. I have argued this in a recent book published by Routledge. Don't try to order it now because it's very expensive in the hardback edition, but a year from now, there will be a paperback edition, which I hope will be more available, accessible. My argument in this book is basically that over the past 220 years or so, since the Industrial Revolution, we have developed a new worldview. And I want to problematize the position of our concept of technology in that worldview. And I finally also want to discuss the relation between what we think of as technology and social global inequalities, particularly in relation to the exchange of material resources between the global south and the global north. And I will argue that this is very much a part of our technology in the wealthy parts of the world. So this is, I think, a representation of our conventional way of understanding technology. It's a blueprint from James Watt's steam engine in the late 18th century. We tend to think of the machine as an ingenious way of applying technological knowledge, engineering knowledge to nature, in order to harness nature. And usually, I would argue most people do not extend their concept of technology beyond this very unproblematic conception of what technology is. I want to argue that the steam engine had a global context without which it would not actually have been able to expand steam power in Britain in the early 19th century. The cotton textiles that were mass-produced with steam technology in British factories were produced for a market. And that market was primarily the purchase of African slaves along the west coast of Africa. They were the main payment during some parts, at least of the late 18th century, was in cotton textiles manufactured in Manchester, and other manufactured goods. And it was the slave trade that was actually a condition for the expansion of British industrial capital during this time, this time in history. Also, the slave owners in America needed cheap clothing for their slaves, so that was another important market for the British textile manufacturers. And finally, of course, the slaves provided an inexpensive source of labor to harvest the raw cotton for the textile industry. So in three important ways, the Industrial Revolution was connected to slavery, which is something we tend to forget. We think that this is something that belonged to the past. And there have been various calculations of how the British Industrial Revolution, the underlying rationale of the Industrial Revolution was very much about saving space in Britain, about what Kenneth Pomeranz called ecological relief. And here are just a few of the ways in which Britain in the 19th century was able to liberate British land from the imperative of delivering food, calories, fibers for the textile industry, timber, and so on. And included in the way that Britain, through its world trade, displaced resource requirements to its colonies and former colonies, you also have the turn to fossil energy, which was a way of actually liberating the surface of the landscape in order to extract energy from subterranean sources. And if we just look at sugar, cotton, timber, and coal, we see that by the late 19th century, these four commodities alone liberated about 195 million hectares of land, of eco-productive land in Britain, which is almost 10 times as much as the total land area of Britain. So what we think of as Britain being the workshop of the world was really, in a metabolic sense, about extracting resources, appropriating resources from the rest of the world through its expansive trade in manufactures. So what I'm arguing quite seriously in a few of my books, and perhaps most explicitly in the most recent one, The Magic of Technology, is that technologies can be seen as magic. I'm an anthropologist to begin with, and I'm interested in the phenomenon of magic, how to define it. And we could argue that magic is to be able to get something done while concealing how it is contingent on human perceptions. I think this is the way a magician tricks us into doing things that seem impossible to us because we are not aware of how our perceptions are being tricked. And I would argue that technology in conjunction with the world market does something very similar, because my main argument is that modern globalized technologies are contingent on socially constructed exchange rates, that is, market prices, and that those prices in turn are contingent on the perceptions and aspirations of market actors, what economists call willingness to pay. Now, willingness to pay is definitely a subjective phenomenon. It's about human perceptions. So if such perceptions are foundational to the very existence of technological accumulation, then technology is indeed a modern form of magic. Going to the market and exchanging one of our labor hours for, say, 5 or 6 Malaysian labor hours, they are equivalent in terms of market price, is a kind of magic. It's a kind of alchemy that we tend to take for granted, but it's really quite insidious when you think about it. We take it for granted that we should be able to exchange our time, our life, for 5 of their lives, so to speak. This is fundamental to the way the global market operates. So the conclusion is that modern technologies are indeed contingent on human perceptions. And of course, this is very difficult for us to digest, because we think of technologies as being objective, physical, material phenomena. How could they possibly be contingent on the state of our consciousness? It sounds quite flaky, but I think it can be reasonably argued. These 2 maps show the global distribution of money and technology, respectively. The upper map, compiled by economists, show what they call GDP density. In other words, how much money is being made per square kilometer in the world. And you see the darkest areas here in North America, Europe, Japan, as being the areas where you have most money being made. I sometimes say that this is capital, the way capital is concentrated. In the lower image, which is a satellite image or a composite satellite image of nighttime lights, you can see the global distribution of technological infrastructure. I take those lights as being proxies for the distribution of what I call technomass, technological infrastructure. And you can see that the 2 maps are almost identical. Where there is money, there is technology, and vice versa, which means that money is fundamentally also a biophysical material process that can be seen from outer space. There is a material aspect to the economy that neoclassical economists simply are not interested in. The unequal flows, the asymmetric flows of resources that I mentioned when I talked about the Industrial Revolution, I talked about the labor time of enslaved people and so on, is not something that belongs like in history 200 years back. It's very much a part of our reality to this day. A colleague of mine by the name of Christian Dorninger helped me to compile these diagrams of the net imports of biophysical resources to these 3 areas you saw on the maps in the last slide, the European Union, Japan, and the US in the 2007. We chose this year because it was the year when all these figures could be assembled. What you see in these diagrams, and they're all representations of global trade, but not measured in money. Instead, they're measured in biophysical metrics such as tons, gigajoule, hectares, or person-year equivalents for each of these 4 different kinds of biophysical resources. And what they show is that the gray column in each case represents imports per capita. The black column represents exports per capita, and the white column represents the difference, that is net imports. And you can see that in all these 3 regions and all the 4 metrics we have, we always get a white column. There is a net import of biophysical resources. And this goes on, so to speak, beyond the field of vision of mainstream economics, because they're only interested in measuring trade in money. Now, if we lift the price tags, this is what shows. So in other words, those highly asymmetric maps we just saw in the previous image are really very much what the global economy is all about. If we look at it through other glasses, not through the perspective simply of money, but through the perspective of material resources. And this could also be expressed in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, of entropy, because we know that the global concentration of technomass, which is represented by this series of icons to the left here, for its very reproduction requires a net import of high order matter energy. So it needs to import more high-order matter energy, or what the physicists call exergy, than it exports. It dissipates this order, and so it exports entropy in the form, for example, of carbon dioxide emissions. The climate change problem is very much a question of the metabolism of the global technomass as viewed from a material biophysical perspective. So what I really want to say is that what we think of as technological progress is something that is basically about ingenuity, and which develops over time. It simply has to do with how smart people are and how much they learn about nature. Is really, this is just one side of what technology is. Of course, we require engineering knowledge, but we also require market prices that make technologies possible in certain parts of the world system. So unequal exchange is actually a condition for technological progress. The question I ask is why we do not allow these asymmetric global resource flows to affect our image of what technology and technological progress are. Without the triangular Atlantic trade, the conditions for British industrialization would have been very different. Why is technology perceived as pure ingenuity, distinguished from unequal relations of exchange? And I think this, what I call technological fetishism or machine fetishism, is a product of our dualistic thinking about nature and society. And I think this is a similar argument to what Bruno Latour was saying about the risks of purifying hybrid phenomena as either nature or society. But Latour actually didn't draw the conclusions that I did, or at least he didn't do it in a way that I was able to comprehend. I found reading him quite difficult. But in our dualistic way of understanding the world in modern Euro-American society, nature is conventionally understood as the material and inexorable causality of the physical universe, whereas society is a domain of constructed and negotiable social relations. And we tend to have this dichotomy between nature and society and find it very difficult to handle phenomena that are hybrids, that have elements of both nature and society. And to simplify it, I think we could think of it in this way, that the dualistic modern classification of technology as nature and economy as society is a result of this worldview. If we divide the world into the material, what Descartes called res extensa, the physical things, versus the relational, which has to do with society, then we have difficulties in handling phenomena like the market or the machine, which are obviously hybrids between nature and society. So the market, in that sense, became the property of the social sciences, primarily economics. It became the economy, and the machine became identified with nature, material nature. So technology is something we think of as natural in a way. It belongs to nature. It is not socially constructed. I would argue that even Karl Marx, who spent his life criticizing capitalism, thought of technology, or what he called the productive forces, he called them nature's free gift to capital. He was very optimistic about the development of steam power in Britain. He could not escape from this dualistic scheme through which technology was innocent and politically and morally neutral, whereas the economy was something that could be changed through political decisions. I would argue that the basic problem, the basic fetish of capitalism is, in fact, technology, and not even Marx. Of course, this was 170 years ago, was able to see that. I think if Bruno Latour had lived longer than he did, he might have agreed on this argument that there is a inherent asymmetry inscribed in the very existence of modern technology. Okay, I know that you people are mostly interested in what we can do about sustainability, or rather unsustainability. And I think in order to deal with the climate disaster, we really need to understand what green technology is, because it seems, for example, that the huge amount of people who have been advocating Green New Deal have had a rather simplified idea of what technology is. We basically need to shift to electric cars and solar panels or biofuels and so on, and then we'll solve the climate disaster. But I think what we need to do is really rethink what modern technology is from a global perspective. It is not just a matter of human ingenuity, but also of asymmetric international resource flows, as I have shown. And these flows are made possible by differences in the global market prices of labor and other resources. And this, of course, is explanation for the many examples we have of green technologies displacing environmental problems rather than solving them. Many years ago, we realized that the biofuels that were supposed to make our driving sustainable were really based on Brazilian sugarcane and the reduction of biodiversity in the Brazilian Cerrado, and also working conditions that approached slavery in Brazil, and all this to make European driving sustainable. A few years later, we heard that the electric cars used in the global north required, among other rare minerals, cobalt that were mined by child slaves in Congo, and so on and so on. We know that the solar panels that have become so accessible and affordable throughout Europe have become affordable because they have been manufactured with Chinese labor, which usually costs about 20% of European labor, and so on. These are examples of how the symbiosis of the world market and technology displaces environmental problems from wealthier parts of the world system to less privileged areas of the world system. I'd like us to go back to Aristotle in ancient Greece. I mean, he lived at a time when what anthropologists call general purpose money, or all purpose money, was initially being created. And I think this was part of his reflexivity about what was going on. And in one sense, he was not at all happy about the fact that Greek society was founded on slavery. And at one point, he argued that it would be wonderful if we could have mechanical slaves. In other words, if we could have machines that did the work for us, then we wouldn't have to feel morally indebted to these people who are doing all the drudgery, all the hard work in society. And it's amazing how this vision has stayed with us over the centuries. Some people studying the abolition of slavery by Britain in 1807 argued that it was not a coincidence that Britain was the first nation to abolish slavery. Britain was simply shifting its mode of hegemony from one mode to another, from colonialism and slavery, which had dominated Britain through the 18th century, to free trade and industrialization in the 19th century. So that I would like to take that argument one step further and argue that the shift to machinery, steam engines, and well, up until modern robots, you can see that this is a robot, up until artificial intelligence, was really very much about creating counterfeit slaves, mechanical organisms that would do the work that horses and slaves used to do prior to the Industrial Revolution. And the general idea was that we would get rid of the hard work. We would replace slaves with machines. But my argument is that machines have not replaced slaves, they have displaced slavery. And I get more and more evidence for this every day. I just recently started reading, I'll show you a book, I don't know if you, The Costs of Connection, and another book called Ghost Work. And there's been a series of articles in the MIT Technology Review about what they call AI colonialism. In other words, artificial intelligence colonialism. And I understand that these miraculous new technologies we have in the wealthy countries are really contingent on very low wage labor in countries like Venezuela, Kenya, and the Philippines. This is where hundreds of thousands of people are sitting, working for $2 or even $1 an hour, data marking. They're annotating or data labeling various kinds of data. They have to make AI contraptions like the electric car. They have to teach them to be able to distinguish different traffic signs and pedestrians and so on, so as to be able to drive. Very much like parents would teach children, you know, you point to something and you call it something, a car, a tree, a house. This is exactly what these people are doing in the global South, teaching our machines how to operate socially in society. And once again, we're seeing how technology is a displacement of labor and also, I would say, environmental loads to less privileged parts of the world system. Okay, so this is a very, I suppose, very dark representation of the possibilities of technology, but I just want to end on a positive note by saying that I do think there are ways of transcending this dilemma, this technological fetishism that we seem to be stuck in, and that is by realizing that changes are should not so much be about transforming technology, which is something that seems to consume 100% of our attention these days, but about the way we organize exchange. The problem, I think, is not the technology itself, it's the notion of all-purpose money. To us, it's like water is to fish, but it's a historically recent idea. The notion that we can exchange almost anything for money. The fact that when we go shopping, we are always looking for the best deals. It sounds self-evident, doesn't it? We buy the stuff that's cheapest. Well, that means we'll be looking for the products that has been produced with the lowest wages and the least regard to environmental concerns. These are the cheapest products. This is why in Sweden we buy Chinese electronics and groceries from Brazil and so on. So globalization is simply an expression of the intrinsic logic of all-purpose money. Pay as little as you can earn as much as you can. If this is what is being called the capitalist system, it is perpetuated every time we buy our groceries. I don't think it's an evil conspiracy. It's simply the aggregate logic of money. Whenever we go shopping, we become part of the capitalist system and we propagate it. So, as ridiculous as it may sound, I believe that humankind sooner or later will have to start thinking about some kind of redesign of money. I'm part of an international project now funded by Formas, the Swedish Research Council, on special purpose money. And we have been comparing different kinds of complementary currencies, universal basic income, and so on, in terms of what advantages and disadvantages they may have. And if I may just go a few minutes or a couple of minutes beyond the time, because I started late, I just want to say that I think there is a distinct possibility. It has been almost implemented in Korea in the form of a universal basic voucher, a kind of money, in quotation marks, that specifies how it is to be used. For example, in Korea, these UBVs can only be used for locally produced goods. This voucher is distributed to all people in accordance with the principle of universal basic income. So they combine the notion of a complementary currency with that of universal basic income, which I think is very much a step in the right direction. The only problem remaining is that these vouchers can only be used for one-way transactions. But if we imagine a society where such vouchers were issued by the state, distributed to all the inhabitants of a country, to be used only for locally produced goods and services, and to be indefinitely recycled within these local spheres of exchange, I think we would radically transform the amount of global transports we're seeing, and also, of course, concomitantly, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are a number of other advantages to such a system, but I will not continue longer than that. Okay, so I will stop sharing now and see if any of you are still with me. Yes, you are. And now the question is, how do we handle a discussion when I can't hear you? I'll see if something has changed here.
Hello, everyone. And Alf, do you hear me?
Sorry, somebody was saying something, but I only heard some. Monica, I think you said something, right?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Could you
put it in the chat function? I see, for some reason, and I can't grasp why, I'm not getting any sound from you people.
Okay, so let's all write questions in the chat and Alf can respond to them as they come in.
I hear that you are speaking, Monica, but I can't hear what you're saying. Okay, we have. I'll check the chat function. See what. Great. Here we have something. Okay. Okay. Ana Margarida Esteves asks, wasn't that supposed to be the vision behind AI? You mean displacing it to poor countries? No? Okay.
Do you mind if I rectify my question?
Well, all the others are hearing you, right? Oh, this is so frustrating.
I will write down.
Linda Sonnerid, I have your chat question here. A question I have in relation to your ending slides on the role of capitalism and technology. There are different technologies emerging in different political economies. For example, nuclear power emerged in a state-centered political economy, while many AI applications emerge in a neoliberal market-centered political economy. I would just like to hear you say something about this aspect. Yeah, okay. So it seems like, Linda, that you're suggesting that different kinds of political economic system will generate different kinds of technologies, or might. Okay, I see you're writing. While you're writing, I would say I doubt it, because I believe that these different political economic systems that we have seen so far all seem to be aiming at instrumental success of various kinds. I haven't thought very much about it. I'll see. I have a new message now from Linda. Yes. Now, Linda writes, it suggests that the hubris around technology can be very strong independently of the political system. And I quite agree. I quite agree. We have, I mean, regardless if it's China or the US or the EU or wherever we are, there's this tremendous trust in technological efficacy and efficiency, and very rarely some thought about whether there are asymmetric flows of resources necessary to create these technologies, which I would say is a universal aspect. Okay, then we have Anna Margarida has clarified. I meant if the initial vision behind AI was not to substitute human labor, liberating humans for creative work and leisure. Yes, that was the vision. I completely agree. And I think most of us still think of it that way. If you look at the debate on AI in the newspapers and in media in general, it's very much about, well, what are we going to do once the machines do it all for us? And will they take over? I mean, the AI debate from my perspective is very is distorted, because very rarely do we consider the global context of AI. It's not like we're expecting household robots or electric cars to become prominent in Burkina Faso, right, or Venezuela. It's in the wealthy countries, and it's very much because of these people working in the South. In the MIT journal I mentioned, there was an interview with a woman in Venezuela who was working for the equivalent of 9 Swedish kronor per hour to label data for the high-tech giants whose executives earn millions, you know, Facebook and Google and so on. So they're really relying on slave labor in a way, I would argue. Okay, and you also ask about special purpose money. What is the risk that it could lead to the reproduction of the logic of seeking the best deal inside compartmentalized markets? Okay, yeah, good point. Well, I'm not so worried about that, actually, because I do believe that the market principle in itself is not the problem. The problem is when the market is global and we don't see the people who are slaving for our comfort. But if we have a fairly localized reach with this complementary currency, then we will have more immediate feedback, and the pricing mechanisms will more closely approximate what Adam Smith once envisaged when he eulogized the market. I'm not opposed to the market as an idea. I'm just opposed to its geographical extent. Okay, Monica asks, do you know anything about the political debate, motives, or contestation when implementing the special purpose currency that you told us about? Yes. The only thing I've written an article about reporting how it works, and I've listened to a YouTube lecture by Joseph Stiglitz where he discusses this. So he's got a lecture from 21, I think, where he really expresses himself very positively about this experiment, where he says that this is something very, very important and very useful. But that's about all I know about it. But from reading the report from a South Korean researcher, then I thought it sounded quite interesting. The state issues these vouchers, distributes it's I think it's actually to an age cohort, people between 18 and 30 or something like that. They're all given these vouchers, and apparently the consequences are quite good from a sustainability perspective. Yes, okay. Could you, Anna says, could you please share the reference to that MIT article? And I will do that. I'll try to share my screen again because I had it here on one of my, let's see. It's this one. Here it is. Seung-Yoon Lee et al. 2020. Can you see that? Okay, good. Seung-Yoon Lee et al. 2020. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop sharing that. Okay, I'll go back to the. Great. I think that was the questions I had at the chat function. So it worked, even though I couldn't hear you. Sorry about that. Any more ideas, or Monica, what do you think? Should we call it a day? Or have I missed something?
What?
Oh, I'm sorry. Monica had a question higher up. Let's see. Ah, yes. The power or possibility of magic is also that we want to be misled. Ah, that's profound. That's true. We want to be misled. How can we come around that? Yes. That is a very profound question, because more and more when I've thought about this, I come to the conclusion that we don't want to see the truth. We don't want, to me, the truth is that what we call progress and development, the kind of technological progress we've seen in Europe since the late 18th century, is a story that gives us hope. And it's something that we want to hold on to. And the whole idea that it is a local story about privileges that Europeans and Euro-Americans can enjoy at the expense of the rest of the world is a story we really don't want to hear. So I think in that sense, yes, we are prone to want to adopt these magical accounts. And I guess that's why most of my hope at this time is not about resuming some kind of progressive development, but rather about the radical rethinking we're seeing, for example, in the degrowth movement, all the talk about pluriverse, and the very few percentage of the people so far who would actually be interested in cutting down on consumption, mobility, energy use, and economic growth. I mean, politically, it's quite impossible at this point, as you all know. Can you imagine a politician saying, well, we need to cut down on European energy use by about 80%? You know, I don't think they'll earn a seat in parliament. So I think we're just too comfortable at this point, at least in Europe, to really want to change things. And historically, I don't know of any single case where a privileged group, social group, has voluntarily given up its privileges. And I think that that's very much what it's about. We don't want to give up our privileges as long as we are as privileged as we are. Okay, Monica, that would be my rather depressive response to your question. Let's see. Ah, yes, Anna Maria, a desire, Anna Margarita, I mean, a desire for a re-enchantment of the world. Yeah, I actually finished a book in Swedish I published a couple of years ago called Kannibalernas maskerad, with the suggestion that when we became modern, we gave up on the idea of heaven and thought about progress instead. And now with the climate crisis, we have to give up on progress. So what are we going to do? Are we going to go back to a spiritual reawakening, a re-enchantment, as you call it? Maybe, it's quite possible. There are people moving in that direction. Unfortunately, I feel too rational to be able to do that myself, but maybe it is absolutely necessary. But in any case, I think we're going to see a shift in terms of social relations, that more intensive care for our close relations. Ideas like we have in Japan, for example, of having robots taking care of old people will probably disappear, and instead a revival of a genuine care for each other, I think. Maybe re-enchantment is part of this, but I still think we're at a very early stage in that transformation. We have two new messages here, right? Okay. Magnus, I'm sorry, I must have missed your question before, Magnus. There are very different conditions locally to produce things, yes, in terms of natural resources, geography, etc. Yeah, okay. Very briefly and very generally, I would respond that the complementary currency that I am advocating would be useful for products and services that have been produced within a certain geographical radius of the point of purchase. But that geographical radius could vary depending on where you are in Sweden or in the world. For example, I would argue that if you compare Lund in the south of Sweden with Arvidsjaur in the far north of Sweden, you would have a very different radius depending on the amount of agricultural land and other resources. So that is sort of the kind of fine tuning that you would have to do. I'm not suggesting that we have the same geographical zone wherever we are in the world. I once got a question from somebody living in Alaska. Well, how am I going to get my oranges? So these are the kinds of problems that show up. Okay, and it's not like I'm suggesting we should get rid of general purpose money. There will always be access to that also. So people will be able to access their medicines or their software or whatever it is that cannot be produced in the local community. It's just that I think we need to have two separate spheres of social life. One abstract that has to do with global capital flows, one local that has to do with actually encountering people and really engaging in social relations. Anna Margarita asks about the title of that book. Do you mean the title of my own book, or? Yes. Okay. So the title of the book is The Magic of Technology. It was published by Routledge just a few months ago. Okay. Oh, yeah. Kannibalernas maskerad. Do you read Swedish? No? Okay. I don't have an English version of it. Okay. Right. And then, yeah. Okay. What about the technology? Should that also be bought with special purpose money? Well, it's amazing. I mean, if you think of how humans have been able to survive on more or less local resources up until a couple of 100 years ago. The question is what we mean by technology. There's definitely technology that requires a global division of labor. I mentioned medical technology and software and so on. And definitely we will need a global exchange sector or a global market for that kind of technology. I definitely believe so. And in this project I mentioned, we're actually thinking about even the complementary currency being a digital currency requiring digital infrastructure. So I'm not a total technophobe, but I do think we need to be very selective about the technologies that we're going to have in the future. Nowadays, it seems like most of the miraculous new technologies we have, including the internet, is used for commercial purposes. The vision for AI and the internet have been completely different, as something liberating, in the same way as Karl Marx once thought of technology as liberating rather than as something, as a means of exploitation. Okay, Magnus asks, is magic and fetishism the same thing? Yes, definitely. It is actually. The word fetishism comes from a Portuguese word, feitiço, which can be literally translated as magic or witchcraft, sorcery. And it was first used by Portuguese merchants traveling along the west coast of Africa in the 15th century and going ashore and finding people worshiping idols and amulets. And so they returned to Europe and said, these Africans are fetishists. They have fetishes. And European Catholics at that time were very adamant about maintaining a strict boundary between magic and religion. So Catholic crucifixes and relics were not fetishes, but whatever Africans were doing was fetishism. But you're absolutely right. In both cases, we are attributing properties of living things to dead objects. This is the way Marx would have defined fetishism, or he also said that fetishism is when relations between humans look like relations between things. And this ties in very well with my understanding of technology. What to us looks like simply a mechanical apparatus, where very different cogwheels, work against each other, is really a bundle of global social relations that have assumed a material form. So machine fetishism is really the latest in a series of fetishisms that go back to what Marx was talking about when he talks about money fetishism and commodity fetishism. I would argue that machine fetishism is simply a variant of commodity fetishism. Marx was a great social scientist, but then to be a Marxist is something completely different. Okay, let's see. At the moment, I can't see any more questions, Monica. Can you? Or
No.
Okay. I really regret not having heard your voices. It would have been so nice to have been in actual contact with you. But thank you anyway for managing to put questions through the chat. And thank you for inviting me, Monica. Okay, so this concludes our session, I assume. Okay. Well, thank you all. I'll shut down now and take care, everybody. Bye. Bye-bye.